You've been stuck inside for 3 days because of rain. You have a roof, you have heating, you have a refrigerator full of food, and a phone full of distractions, and you're miserable. Now remove all of that. Remove the roof, remove the walls, remove the stored food, the dry clothes, the waterproof jacket, the hot drink. Put yourself in a forest somewhere in prehistoric Europe 60,000 years ago during a rainy season that doesn't end for weeks. The temperature is hovering just above cold enough to kill you. Everything you need to survive fire, food, warmth becomes exponentially harder to obtain the wetter it gets. How do you survive that? Not as a thought experiment, as a daily reality, as the baseline condition of being human for the vast majority of human history. This is the question nobody thinks to ask about ancient humans, because we're usually too busy asking about the dramatic stuff, the predators, the migrations, the wars. But rain is unglamorous and relentless, and it was arguably more consistently dangerous to early humans than almost anything with teeth. It killed fires. It caused hypothermia. It rotted food. It flooded shelters. It lasted for months. And ancient humans not only survived it, they thrived in some of the wettest, most brutal climates on the planet. They crossed rainforests. They lived through Ice Age winters with precipitation that would shut down a modern city. They figured out without textbooks or Gore-Tex how to keep a species alive in conditions that would end most modern humans within days. Let's find out how. Start with the most immediate problem rain creates for a human being without shelter. Not drowning. That's a different conversation. The real killer is heat loss. Water conducts heat away from the human body roughly 25 times faster than air does. This is not a small difference. This is the difference between sitting in a cold room feeling chilly and sitting in a cold lake dying. When you're wet, your body is losing heat at a rate your metabolism may not be able to compensate for, especially if the ambient temperature is low and the wind is blowing. This is why hypothermia kills so efficiently in wet conditions, even when the temperature is nowhere near freezing. You don't need ice. You need wet clothes, a mild wind, and a temperature somewhere around 10 degrees. That's a British summer. That's a spring night in Central Europe. That's a perfectly ordinary day in dozens of environments where early humans lived and died. Ancient humans knew this, not from reading about thermodynamics, from watching each other die. The first and most critical survival skill in wet conditions isn't finding food or building shelter. It's maintaining core body temperature. And the strategies ancient humans developed to do this were more sophisticated than most people assume. Start with fire, because fire is the obvious answer, and also a deeply complicated one in the context of rain. Fire and rain are enemies. Wet wood won't ignite. Wet tinder won't catch. A fire that gets rained on dies. And a dead fire in a hypothermic situation isn't an inconvenience. It is a death sentence written in wet ash. So how did ancient humans keep fire alive in the rain? The answer is that they thought about fire the way modern humans think about electricity, as infrastructure, not as an event. Fire wasn't something you made when you needed it. Fire was something you maintained continuously, because starting it from scratch in wet conditions without modern tools is one of the hardest things a human being can do with bare hands. Carrying fire was a practiced skill across virtually every ancient human culture that has been studied. Embers wrapped in slow-burning organic material, damp moss, fungus, bark from specific trees, could be transported for hours across terrain. The Inuit carried smoldering material in enclosed containers. Indigenous Australians used particular slow-burning woods to move live coals across vast distances. Archaeological evidence from sites across Europe shows hearths that burned not intermittently but continuously for years, maintained, fed, protected, treated as a living thing that required tending. The fire was never allowed to go out because the cost of losing it was simply too high. This required dedicated roles within groups. In bad weather, someone's entire job was to keep the fire alive. Not to hunt, not to forage, to sit with the fire, shield it from wind and rain, feed it, and ensure the group didn't wake up cold and dark in the middle of a storm. This is one of the earliest divisions of labor we can infer from the archaeological record. Before anyone specialized in tools or hunting or medicine, someone specialized in fire. The firekeeper wasn't a secondary role. In sustained wet conditions, they were the most important person in the group. But fire requires shelter to survive heavy rain. Which brings us to the second major piece of the puzzle. Ancient humans were not the cave-dwelling primitives of popular imagination. The cave-dwelling image is partly an artifact of preservation bias. Caves preserve evidence. So caves are where archaeologists look, and therefore we conclude that caves are where ancient humans lived. But caves are rare. They're often cold, frequently damp, sometimes occupied by animals considerably more dangerous than the rain, and geographically limited. Most ancient humans didn't live in caves. They lived in structures they built. And those structures, even the earliest ones, show a level of environmental intelligence that is genuinely surprising. The oldest known deliberately constructed shelters date to around 400,000 years ago, long before anatomically modern humans existed. These weren't elaborate, but they were intentional. Branches angled to shed water, leaves layered in overlapping rows like shingles, each layer covering the gap of the one below so that rain ran off the surface rather than penetrating it. The same principle as a modern roof, arrived at independently, with no engineering education, by hominins whose brain volume was somewhat smaller than yours. By the time modern humans were moving across the globe, temporary shelters had become remarkably sophisticated given the materials available. Mammoth bone structures found in Eastern Europe, dating to around 15,000 years ago, show deliberate architectural thinking. Heavy bones anchored into the ground to resist wind, hides stretched tightly across the frame. What appear to be insulation layers inside, pressing warmth inward rather than letting it leak out. These weren't holes to hide in. They were engineered environments, built specifically to manage heat and exclude water. The hide construction is worth pausing on because it represents one of the most consequential material innovations in human history, and it happened specifically as a response to cold and wet conditions. Animal hides, properly prepared, are nearly waterproof. The natural fat content in untreated hide provides baseline water resistance. When ancient humans began the labor-intensive process of turning raw hide into usable material, scraping, stretching, treating with animal fats, smoking over fire, they were essentially inventing the principle behind modern technical outerwear. Flexible, durable, thermally insulating when dry, significantly more water-resistant than anything woven from plant fiber. The cognitive leap required to go from this animal has a skin to I can turn that skin into something that protects my skin is not trivial. It requires understanding cause and effect across a delayed timeline. The animal dies today. The hide is worked over several days. The finished product keeps someone dry weeks from now. This is planning. Abstract reasoning. The ability to solve a future problem using present effort. Archaeological evidence of hide scraping tools appears at least 120,000 years ago in Africa, possibly earlier. This predates what researchers typically classify as modern behavioral complexity, which tells you something important. The pressure to stay dry was so consistent, so lethal, and so relentless that it drove cognitive solutions very early in the human story. Rain didn't just threaten ancient humans, it shaped them. Now let's talk about something that receives almost no attention in popular accounts of prehistoric survival. Landscape reading. Modern humans experience weather as something that arrives unexpectedly and happens to us. We check an app, we get caught in the rain, we go inside. We have outsourced our weather awareness almost entirely to technology, and in doing so, we have lost the underlying perceptual skill that once sat beneath it. Ancient humans had no such option. Their survival depended on reading the environment, continuously anticipating weather before it arrived. and making decisions based on signals that most modern people would walk right past. The smell of rain before it comes petrichor is a real olfactory signal, produced by moisture interacting with soil compounds. So is the shift in animal behavior that precedes storms by hours. Birds change their altitude and flight patterns. Insects cluster and swarm. Certain mammals move toward higher ground or into denser cover. The visual texture of clouds carries information about what's coming and how fast. Wind direction shifts tell a practiced observer which way a system is moving. The behavior of open water surfaces changes in ways that are readable if you know what to look for. Ancient humans read these signals the way you read road signs. Automatically, fluently, because their survival depended on doing so every single day. Group decisions about movement and shelter construction were likely made hours before rain arrived, based on accumulated environmental reading so refined it would seem almost impossible to a modern observer. You don't get caught in a downpour when you've been reading the sky all morning, and you have 3 hours of daylight to find elevated ground and build a rain structure before the first drop falls. Researchers who spend extended time with traditional hunter-gatherer communities today consistently describe a level of environmental awareness that seems extraordinary by modern standards. The ability to read incoming weather through smell, sound, wind feel, and animal behavior simultaneously, and to translate that reading into accurate near-term predictions is not a mystical gift. It is expertise. Specifically, it is the kind of expertise that forms when getting the answer wrong means someone dies. We had this once. All of us. We traded it for a notification on a phone screen. The notification is convenient. But something real was exchanged. Here's something that almost never appears in popular accounts of ancient rain survival: the specific geography of where ancient humans chose to make camp, and how much of their survival had less to do with what they built and more to do with where they put it. Elevation matters enormously in sustained wet conditions. Cold air sinks, moisture pools in low terrain. On a rainy night, the difference between sleeping on a gentle rise and sleeping in a hollow can be the difference between waking up damp and waking up sitting in several inches of cold water. Ancient humans understood this not from a manual, but from immediate, repeated, costly experience. You camp in the hollow once during a heavy rain. You don't camp there again. South-facing slopes in the northern hemisphere receive more direct sunlight. They dry faster after rain. They stay fractionally warmer through cold nights. Ancient humans camped on them deliberately when weather was uncertain. Tree canopy density determines how much precipitation actually reaches the ground. Dense broadleaf canopy intercepts a significant portion of light to moderate rainfall before it ever gets to the forest floor. Ancient humans camped beneath it deliberately. Dense conifer stands behave similarly and have the added advantage of wind resistance. Certain rock formations create natural overhangs that appear as sheltering sites in the archaeological record across virtually every inhabited continent, not because ancient humans couldn't build, but because a natural overhang is a head start on rain protection that saves hours of construction labor. The knowledge of which specific locations within a given landscape offered the best natural shelter from rain was accumulated across generations of use and transmitted deliberately to the next. Groups returned to the same reliable sheltering spots year after year, the same way they returned to the same hunting grounds and seasonal foraging areas. Archaeological sites showing repeated habitation across thousands of years, layer upon layer of ash, bone, and discarded tools at the same geographic location are direct evidence of this. The spot was good. The people who used it before knew it was good. They passed that knowledge forward. Landscape knowledge was rain survival. They were inseparable. Let's talk about the body itself, because ancient humans also had physiological advantages in wet and cold conditions that most modern people have partially lost through lifestyle, and that researchers think we've surrendered more completely than we realize. The cold shock response is a useful place to start. Sudden immersion in cold water triggers an immediate cascade of physiological reactions: sharp inhalation, cardiovascular stress, involuntary hyperventilation. This response is largely automatic, and it accounts for a significant number of cold water deaths each year, including in individuals who were perfectly capable swimmers in warm conditions. The cold gets them before the water does. What's less widely known is that the cold shock response is modifiable. People who are regularly exposed to cold water, cold weather, sustained temperature variation show measurably reduced responses over time. The body adapts. The physiological alarm quiets, not because the danger changes, but because regular exposure calibrates the system to handle it more efficiently. Ancient humans were cold regularly, wet regularly, exposed to temperature variation daily in a way that no modern human in a climate-controlled environment can match. Their baseline physiological response to cold and wet was not the same as yours. They weren't different humans. They were trained humans trained by an environment that offered no alternative. There's also the question of metabolic adaptation at the population level. Hunter-gatherer communities living in consistently cold, wet climates show metabolic profiles that differ measurably from sedentary populations in thermally stable environments. Higher resting metabolic rates in cold, more efficient heat generation from brown adipose tissue, a specific type of fat that produces heat directly rather than storing energy. These adaptations are partly heritable, built up over generations of sustained selective pressure in cold climates, but they're also physiological, maintained by ongoing cold exposure, and lost when that exposure ends. The Inuit are the most studied population in this regard, and their metabolic response to cold is well documented. Less widely known is that many of the same adaptations appear in any human being who is regularly exposed to cold, regardless of ancestry. The body responds to the demand placed on it. It always has. Ancient humans in wet, cold climates were not surviving despite their physiology. They were surviving with physiology that a lifetime of cold exposure had specifically refined for exactly this. Not better humans. Prepared humans. Now let's talk about the social layer, because this is where ancient rain survival becomes genuinely interesting and is almost never discussed. Surviving rain alone is hard. Surviving rain as a coordinated group is a different problem entirely, and ancient human social structures were built in part around the collective management of environmental threats, including weather. Shared body heat is not a metaphor. It is a measurable survival mechanism. A group of human bodies pressed together under a rain cover generates and retains heat collectively in ways that isolated individuals cannot. The person on the outside of the sleeping group is colder than the person at the center. Ancient humans knew this. Sleeping arrangements in cold, wet conditions were communal, dense, and pragmatic. Privacy is a warm weather luxury. When the temperature drops and the rain doesn't stop, you sleep close to the warmest available bodies, and the arrangement isn't social, it's thermal. The firekeeping role mentioned earlier was part of a broader system of labor distribution that activated during bad weather. In the anthropological record of groups studied in challenging climates, bad weather produces implicit task reallocation. Physically capable individuals take on structural and maintenance tasks. More experienced members make decisions about movement and camp placement. Children are kept central and warm, insulated by bodies and positioning. The group reorganizes around survival, demands the way a modern organization might reorganize around a crisis fluidly, based on role and capability, without formal announcement. The group functions as a thermoregulation system, not merely a social unit. This is why the image of the lone ancient human surviving against nature on individual grit is mostly a modern invention. Solitary survival in genuinely hostile wet conditions is achievable over short periods by well-trained individuals. Over weeks and months through a full rainy season, the survival unit is always the group. The social bond was not a feature of ancient human life that existed despite the harsh conditions. It was infrastructure built specifically to handle them. The knowledge transmission angle matters here too. Every technique that worked the specific tree bark that holds an ember long enough to carry across a day's travel, the method of layering hides to prevent condensation on the inside surface, The behavioral signals in bird flight that predict incoming rain 2 hours before it arrives, none of it was rediscovered independently by each generation. It was taught, passed from older members to younger ones through direct instruction, demonstration, and years of shared practice. The accumulated knowledge of a group about how to survive its specific environment was one of its most valuable collective assets, possibly the most valuable one it had. This is why the loss of an experienced elder in a hunter-gatherer community was not merely a personal tragedy. It was a survival event. The knowledge that left with them could not be quickly regenerated. It had taken decades to build. Researchers believe this is one reason that care for older, non-productive individuals appears in the archaeological record earlier than most people expect. Providing for people who could no longer hunt, build, or forage wasn't abstract altruism. It was the practical recognition that those individuals were the living memory of everything the group knew about staying alive through a rainy season. Their knowledge was the infrastructure. Keeping them alive was maintenance. Now, food because rain doesn't pause hunger, and foraging in sustained wet weather creates its own specific set of problems. Prolonged rain changes the food landscape dramatically and fast. Animals take shelter and become difficult to track. Plant foods that are normally reliable seeds, berries, roots become waterlogged, hidden under mud, or functionally inaccessible for days at a stretch. Fire, needed to make most foods safe and digestible, is harder to maintain. The convergence of higher caloric demand from cold and reduced food availability creates a nutritional pressure that a group without preparation cannot survive for long. Ancient humans managed this in several ways. The first was strategic food storage. Evidence of deliberate caching appears deep in the prehistoric record-preserved meat, dried plant food. Stored nuts buried in thermally stable locations away from moisture or elevated above ground level to prevent rot. This is not instinct, it is foresight. The recognition that the season will turn, that what is available today will not be available in 3 weeks, and that the gap needs to be bridged by something you built before the rain came. Planning for weather you cannot see yet is not a modern cognitive achievement. It is ancient. The second was opportunistic menu adjustment. Rain produces its own food sources for those paying attention. Earthworms surface in enormous numbers after sustained rainfall. Freshwater fish shift position predictably during flooding and can be intercepted by someone who understands the pattern. Specific fungi and mushrooms fruit prolifically in wet conditions. Snails, frogs, and certain insects become more accessible precisely because moisture activates them. Ancient humans who were attending carefully, and they were always attending carefully, shifted their diet accordingly. What they ate changed with the weather. Dietary flexibility wasn't a preference. It was a survival trait expressed daily. The third factor was the most important. Food was shared equitably during lean periods. A well-provisioned individual inside a starving group is not a survivor. They are a casualty waiting for the surrounding social structure to collapse. Sharing norms in hunter-gatherer societies, visible across virtually every culture studied by anthropologists, exist partly because sustained cooperation through lean, cold, wet seasons is what actually keeps everyone alive long enough for the sun to come back. The rainy season wasn't just endured, it was prepared for, adapted to, and shared through as a collective problem with a collective answer. Let's zoom out one final time and look at where ancient humans actually chose to settle, because it tells you something remarkable about their relationship with persistent wet weather. Given a free choice, modern humans tend toward moderate climates. Not too hot, not too cold. Stable and predictable. You can see this in how global population density maps look even today. Ancient humans did not have this luxury in the early stages of dispersal. They went everywhere. Into monsoon-soaked Southeast Asia, into the perpetually wet temperate rainforests along the Atlantic coast of Europe, into river delta systems that flooded seasonally with reliable violence, into the subarctic fringes, where the ground is wet or frozen for most of the year, and precipitation arrives in forms that erase visibility entirely. They didn't occupy these places in spite of the rain. In many cases, they went to them because of what the rain produced. Wet environments are productive environments. Rivers fed by consistent rainfall run full of fish. Wet forests generate the dense plant and animal communities that make foraging viable year-round. The same precipitation that made survival technically harder made the food supply richer, more diverse, and more consistent than anything available in a dry climate. Ancient humans made a calculation not in a meeting, but through the slow drift of populations toward resources across thousands of generations, that the difficulty of wet conditions was worth the abundance those conditions created. This is a fundamentally different relationship with rain than the one most of us carry today. We experience rain as interruption, something that cancels plans, ruins shoes, forces cancellations. Ancient humans experienced it as a condition, one that required management, one that created both problems and opportunities, one that demanded skill and rewarded preparation. But not an enemy, not something alien to the world they inhabited. They were part of that world. They had always been part of it. The layered hide that kept the rain off someone's shoulders. The ember carried inside a wrap of slow moss across a day of travel through wet forest. The angled branches shedding water in overlapping layers above a sleeping group. The south-facing slope chosen not by accident, but by someone who had spent enough cold nights in the wrong place to understand why the right place mattered. The food cache buried before the first clouds thickened, because someone had lived through enough hungry, rainy seasons to know what was coming. All of it points to the same conclusion. Ancient humans didn't just survive rain. They built a civilization of technique, knowledge, and social structure specifically designed to manage it. And that civilization that accumulated practical intelligence about how a wet world works was more sophisticated, more carefully calibrated to actual conditions than most modern people are willing to credit. We have Gore-Tex now. We have insulated walls and central heating and drainage systems that move water away from our foundations before we notice it arrived. We have weather radar and waterproof boots and the option to simply stay inside until the whole thing passes. But we built all of that because somewhere in the deep past, someone spent a very long, very wet night working out that water runs downhill, that certain fats make animal skin nearly waterproof, that smoke keeps the inside of a shelter dry, and that staying pressed against other warm bodies is sometimes the entire difference between making it until morning and not. Every single technology we use to manage rain today is downstream of that cold, firelit, wet season night. They figured it out first, without any of the tools we treat as baseline. Using nothing but accumulated knowledge, careful attention, social cooperation, and the absolute refusal of the human species to simply accept being rained on. That's not primitive survival. That's the foundation everything else was built on.